Okay, I think we're going to jump right in. Oh, yeah, there we go. Thank you. All right, thank you everybody for coming to what is our inaugural Outside the Bubble series that has been set up by the EMCR Brain Science Network. So the representatives from that organisation here with you today are myself and Hannah. So the EMCR Brain Science Network has a core aim to establish a platform for EMCR brain scientists in Australia to develop future leaders and drive Australian brain science forward, however that may be, in all of the many different and wonderful ways that brain science can be and where it can take us. So what I'd like to do is get right into why we're all here. So I'm going to pass you along to Hannah Keage to make introductions to our panel today and get this event started, which we're hoping will be very conversational and can have everybody involved. So, Hannah.
Thank you, and thank you to Phil and Olga for joining us today. I think this is undeniably the hottest topic to talk about in academia at the moment, and I think that's shown by we have over 170 registrants today, which is just incredible. So we're here to talk about what it's like to have a job outside the bubble. Our purpose is just to gather information. We're going to do that over a series of these conversations across 2021. Bernie and I would like to make this very conversational. Please enter any questions into the Q&A box. This is a webinar view, so we can only see the four panelists in this view. Please enter your questions. We've also gathered some via email and Twitter across the week. We have lots of questions, and if we can't get into them all today, then we'll continue the conversations with others with jobs outside the bubble this year. So I'd like to welcome Phil and Olga, but actually I'd like them to start off with telling us about their own journeys and in particular how they got to the positions they're in today. So thank you for joining us, and perhaps I can hand over to Olga first and then Phil can give his story. Thank you.
Basically my resume in 5 minutes, 2 minutes. So I started as typical academic, going through PhD into postdoc. In 2014, I received fellowship from UTS, Chancellor's Postdoctoral Research Fellowship. So I joined UTS as a young academic there, and from there just continued stepping on academic ladder. I've been promoted to senior lecturer in 2016, I believe. I got fellowship from NHMRC RC Dementia Research Fellowship in 2016, I believe, right? And after another couple of years, I've been promoted to associate professor in UTS, and about now 6 months ago, I decided to step off that ladder and jumped over into academia. So right now I'm leading research. I'm a senior scientist at a company called Alkalizer Technologies, which is known company for breathalyzers and drugalyzers, and you probably all seen on RBT those breathalyzers that you blow. That's exactly what company is doing here. So I moved from Sydney to Perth for the job, and now I'm leading my research team here.
So a bit of my background. I did my undergrad at La Trobe University, where I did physics and maths. And jokingly at the time, I said to someone, I'll pick up programming so that if things get bad, I can always get a job at a bank somewhere. Strangely enough, 10 years, 15 years later. After university, though, I went and worked at CSIRO. So I really had no idea what I wanted to do. I still, frankly, don't. But there was a good opportunity to work in a weather forecasting team. So we were working on stream flow modeling and whether we could get flood levels and help dam operators and farmers forecast their water usage. This was a particularly big deal back then because there was some very large national institutes to look at climate change and how that would impact farmers. And there was the Murray-Darling work going on as well. So that was a bit of fun. And it was my first chance to do science and do translational work simultaneously. However, with the changing of the tides, there was not as much money for climate change after a couple of years in that position. And I didn't really want to stick around and watch what happened. So I sent a cold email to Gary Egan, who's a professor at Monash University, just after seeing a press release about a supercomputer being used for medical images. And I thought, oh yeah, maybe medical seems to have good funding. And I started a PhD. And really that's about as much thought as I put into it. I think back on it now and think, oh my God, I was reckless. But that's what I did. That was how I picked my supervisor. That's how I got my project over a series of coffees with him, and then an application to the Alzheimer's Australia Dementia Research Foundation, who I think is now called something else, Dementia Australia maybe. So did my PhD, stuck around in that lab with a postdoc. My PhD was mostly MRI research, looking at how we could map oxygen and iron in the brain to better understand vascular dementias, but also just function and physiology. And my postdoc, I moved into looking at PET imaging, so using a bit of radiation to look at glucose across the brain, all feeding into that sort of energetics space. And I got in a pretty negative spot after about 2 years in there. Research was great. Most of my collaborators were great. Had a falling out with a couple of them, had a big falling out with management. And I was just struggling with a lot of stuff in academia. And around that time, a friend of mine, one of my groomsmen, sent me a text saying, how are you going? I just got promoted at NAB and things are pretty good. What would it take for you to join me? I jokingly said a 6-pack because that's sort of where I was at the time. But that kicked off 8 to 12 weeks of me thinking about a transition. And it was really that much of a slow burn before I eventually gave it a crack with 3 interviews of mostly me asking them, why should I come into industry? Am I going to hate this less than academia? And that was about that was actually 2 years ago that I started that journey. And I've been at National Australia Bank for a bit over 18 months now. And what I do there, originally I did research and development data science. So it was a really general purpose. We've got a new problem or a new technology, or we want someone who will go to a genetics conference or a medical conference and look for a new idea or algorithm or modeling technique that might be helpful for stopping financial crime or detecting fraud or deciding on home loan applications, whatever. It was a really open position. And about a month ago, I took a new job at NAB, which is the manager of privacy technology and ethics in artificial intelligence. So now I'm working in a related but slightly different team.
Thanks both. Really interesting stories. And I know, Phil, that you just touched on this a little bit, and I hope I get this right, but I also believe that when you left, you made that really big decision to turn down a coveted investigator grant. So I guess part of the next question may touch on this about, when did you know it was time to go? You talked about, a bit about that, Phil, but Olga, I'd love to hear your story about the moment you knew, or did it happen for you gradually? There's so many ways that this could happen, and it would be great to hear a bit more about what came into the decision, if it was easy enough to just go stuff this, or you really had to do a pro and con. Olga, do you want to go first? Give Phil a bit of a break after he kind of...
Okay, so for me, that process of thinking, going off academia actually started several years ago. So my passion was about commercialization. I really wanted to bring research out of lab and into markets. So I was already involved in a couple of commercialization projects, and that was really my passion. So, and about maybe 2 years ago, so I really started thinking how I can jump from academia to industry or what steps I was doing. But I never really did anything into that space physically. So when COVID happened, I've been working with one of our industry partner who is a part of ARC funded Industrial Research Hub. So we started working on a COVID test, rapid COVID test, and development at UTS, and we brought it from an idea into proof of concept, and basically it was sort of ready for translation into industry partner. And one day, general manager of the company said, well, I'm looking people who will take that translation and how to bring that. I didn't put my hand, even though I sort of was thinking, but I didn't put my hand onto that. And essentially, for me, one phone call from general manager company took, well, Olga, what would you to bring you here? And I said, well, this. And the decision was from there really, really quick, because that was pretty much was perfect opportunity. It's exactly what I wanted. It's still to work in research, but working directly on research translation, still working on interface university and industry and bringing products to the market. So for me, essentially from that phone call and decision was pretty quick and happened logically and organically for me, and say, yes, that's exactly where I want to find myself right now. And that's how it happened.
Thanks, Olga. So Phil, to expand a bit on it for you, was there a specific moment? Did you have to go back and forth and think about your decision, or did what you told us before, was that it for you? You knew that you wanted to leave?
No, it was really up and down. And even the moment that I officially resigned at Monash, I actually received an NHMRC investigator grant about 12 hours after I submitted that form. So I very quickly reconsidered, and that kicked off the whole process that I thought I just finished over again to reconsider, and that was tough. But no, the 8 to 12 weeks, I was really dancing between the two. And looking back, I won't get too far into this, but having really good mentors through that was critical. From whether it was my supervisor or other people in academia internationally, I had a team of mentors, and I went to all of them. I went to my mum multiple times to go through that thought process and get there and help me as I oscillated between the two. But for me, a lot of it came down to why I was in academia. And I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to make impact. And one of the reasons I was struggling was because of frustrations with doing that, whether it was KPIs that didn't align with that, or compromises along the way with experimental design or which question to do next, because one had a better chance of becoming a Nature paper, or one fit my next grant application story better and didn't need as much justification, as many words to explain why I moved that way. I really struggled with those compromises. I felt that they were compromises, and I felt that I was doing the long hours and the low wage and the insecurity and everything else, and it was all worth it as long as I could have impact. And if that was compromised, then what was the point? And it was really sitting there and seeing the next opportunity for impact and whether or not to take it, whether or not to stick around and pursue that one. Would that be the piece? It was that point that I oscillated on. Everything else was a little bit, it was important, but peripheral. the work-life balance, whether I'd like it at NAB, whether NAB was even the job to go to, they were all peripheral. The core one was, is this still worth it? Am I going to get the objective? Am I going to be able to achieve anything? And like, don't get me wrong, there were some fantastic collaborators I worked with where I think we made real differences. Working with the team out at the Fitzgerald Lab in WA, which was a bit of a collaboration for me, that I felt like that was getting to something real that would make a real impact. But looking back 18 months later, nearly all of those real impactful pieces I was able to maintain after leaving. And in some ways, I think I actually had more freedom and more ability to have impact. And my Google Scholar took off after I left for that reason, because I could focus on the bits that I wanted to get out, and I could just get on with it and not worry about the repercussions to my promotion application or fellowship application.
That is a fantastic point. I think we all have to ask ourselves and reflect on why we're doing what we're doing more often. And Phil, you did sort of touch on it, actually the next question, and we've had multiple questions come in via email, touching on the hangovers of leaving academia. So of course, we're all involved in projects that have like long-term outcomes. So perhaps it's perhaps a little different to leaving a different job where you might have made commitments in terms of manuscripts, analyses, students, and perhaps PhD students that, could be there in 3 or 4 years' time, research assistants, grants. I was wondering if you could both touch on how you personally manage those academic hangovers in terms of roles and responsibilities after you made the move. Phil, do you want to actually go first now? Because you're actually sort of getting to that point in your last response, and we can go to Olga.
Yeah, no worries. So one of my non-negotiables when I interviewed for the job was that I've got students, PhD students, and I'm going to see them through. Now, that might not be as a university academic, that might just be as a private citizen that jumps on a Zoom once a fortnight and reads some drafts, but it was a non-negotiable. So being in a commercial space, company on the ASX, I had to declare that as a conflict in case. And you might see this as a little bit silly, but Monash University could apply for a mortgage with NAB, right? Like businesses need banks, the same as we need credit cards and whatever else, or want credit cards. And that was just a non-negotiable. And they had no problem, like as long as we were all open and transparent and upfront, and very clear that I wasn't working with Monash on how we're going to overthrow the banks and crypto and whatever else. Like it had to be clear separation, but trauma and MRI and PET imaging, NAB's not looking to diversify in that direction, so that was okay. But that was the first one, and most of the work that I've been involved with since leaving full-time academia has been in a supervisory role or a consulting role or a supporting role, which I think I'm actually better suited to. My life is certainly better suited to, because I loved that part of being in academia, and it's been a real treat to keep it with me. The other work where I was a lead author or my own experiments, I had a really big moral and ethical dilemma with leaving with data sets already collected, especially the ones where radiation was involved and volunteers had come in to get PET doses, and I was going to let that sit on a hard drive somewhere. That was really hard. And I raised that repeatedly with different people and found a really good arrangement with my old supervisor head, where he would keep me on a casual contract so that I could keep access to the system so we could work on these. We brought on other co-authors to help where there was a little bit too much work left or I couldn't dedicate enough time, and we just worked through it. And one paper after another we got to push through. If anything, it got pushed through quicker because I wasn't putting time into the next grant or planning the next, you have this whole factory, this whole pipeline running with all papers in difference, and I just drained the pipeline. And you just think, wow, if I only worked on my science, how much I'd spit out. But of course, the pipeline runs out, there's nothing left now, or very little left. But being able to get those through and see those through, it was actually easier. And I found that even just setting aside half a day a week was often more time than I got when I was in full-time academia, once you put everything else together, to just answer revisions, answer reviewer comments, revise manuscripts, do analysis. And it also meant that I pulled on a few additional students where I had work that was almost finished and or halfway through, and I got to transition that to a student and let them lead. And, often you're really reluctant to empower your students with some of your babies, like your really good ones that you're passionate about. And in every single situation where that happened, it's been a huge success. And, I've got an additional level of pride with that work now, seeing how they've taken it and their spin, and often seeing my own flaws where they've looked at it, seen something completely different. I've been like, why didn't I see that? Why didn't I do that? And that's because they were leading it. So in my experience, all those loose ends, the stuff, we've been able to close it out. There's one or two that are still sitting in revision. I've got 2.5 more students to see through, but it's been great for me. It's been a great experience to focus on those, and that's given me a different appreciation for my old position and a different perspective because I didn't have a hard cutoff.
So from my perspective, before leaving, I transferred all my PhD students to secondary supervisors. So and I only had few. Most of the PhD students, they finished before that. So there were a few hiccups, but at that stage, because I didn't have any new starters, so most of the students already been in their second and third year, so they already took off, knew what they're doing, and with all of my students, the secondary supervisors always been involved from start, and they knew what's happening. So it was relatively easy to transfer those students to secondary supervisors. In saying that, one of the PhD students joined me here at the company as an PhD internship student. So he's still here doing projects, and I'm sort of still involved in his supervision and telling him, well, you still need to do this or that for your thesis, and you need to write this or that paper, and need to do these experiments. But in terms of paper writing, that's my mission, and some people find it really surprising. I hate writing papers. So for me, cutting out that piece of writing papers, and so there are a few papers still coming in that involve in editing or just as a co-author involved in those papers, which is I read and check if everything is all right. But a part of them, for me, moving to industry, I don't need to write any really those papers, like Phil said, that needed to spin for high impact or to keep my citations level or to get into to get the next grant. So I'm pretty happy about that. I don't really need to think about that anymore. And my papers I'm writing, it's more industry reports, and which is so much easier to write because you write to a point, and it's getting the impact that it does within the industry. So for me, was cut from academia to industry was more clear cut. So I left things that were in academia, mostly in academia, and moving into new space. I really wanted to focus on what I came to do here. Yeah.
So for most of us here today, we're from an academic background. Maybe many of us don't even have any idea about what industry really looks like. And so what I want to ask you is, what are the things that we don't know about industry, or the thing that surprised you the most in your transition out of academia?
For me, the most surprising thing was people actually here were willing to help me, saying in terms of like admin work, no, you don't need to do that. We're here for you to help you. You don't need to do that. That was like, are you kidding me? Like, I've spent now several years of doing all sorts of applications, submissions, contracts, and everything. And now people say, no, you spend your time where you're supposed to do what you work to do. And you don't need to let us do our job. And I'm like, oh, okay. Is it real? But yeah, it's real.
Very, very, very similar. There's a really strange appreciation or focus on what your job is and isn't. And, you know, particularly if you've done a PhD and a postdoc and everything, you've probably been working in some kind of professional capacity for 10 or so years. In academia, you feel like a junior because you're surrounded by people who've been doing it for 30 or 40 years, and you don't have a lot of support staff, and you're running on a shoestring budget and everything else. Whereas in industry, it's like, that means you're really senior and you shouldn't waste your time on that. We can go get someone to do it. It's not worth our money is almost the way it's like, you know, if we want someone to do that paperwork, we'll hire someone to do it. That's not what you're here for. And that's really refreshing, but it's also kind of scary because then I feel like I should be doing more with my time when I'm not doing that paper. But I think the other piece that's been really big for me is the diversity of culture. So I worked at a lot of different universities. I visited labs overseas for extended periods of time, and I really felt there wasn't that much diversity between the different groups. Academia was kind of academia. Especially around Australia, everyone deals with ARC and MRC. Everyone's in mostly the same funding environment. There's a few unique cases. There's groups that have got a really good industry collaborator. There's some that have really good foundations behind them. You've got some really toxic departments and some really positive departments. But generally speaking, the enterprise bargaining agreements are all the same. The structures are the same. The levels are the same. It's all quite similar. And coming across to NAB, the people sitting next to me have a completely different culture. And it would be really trivial for me to completely change my environment if I didn't like something about it. Because that manager over there aligns with my interests, or that department over there has a structure that's more aligned to the way I do work. Maybe they're really horizontal, maybe they're really vertical, or maybe they work in collaborative unstructured teams, or maybe they're really rigid and dogmatic, framework driven. And that's just in one organization. And I think that's often lost in the industry versus academia conversation. Often it's better to think about it as maybe breaking academia into like support staff and like running labs and more of the administrative work versus the tenure track work, research work versus the teaching work as the three very different environments. But then on the other side, industry, just thousands of different companies with completely different cultures and different departments within them. And that's kind of lost, I think. And it's freeing because you don't feel like you're trapped in that one environment.
Really interesting point. The next question that Bernie and I had sort of brainstormed earlier in the week that was also reflected in a question we received by email was, what are the least useful and most useful skills that industry sort of thinks about academia? So I think this might be interesting just in an applied way in the day-to-day, you know, life of your job, but also maybe I think people are thinking about their CVs and, you know, what are the things that industry is looking for that academia has, and what is industry not looking for that we might be putting at the top of our CVs that, you know, is a bit of a waste of space. Olga, do you want to jump in first? You've unmuted.
It's a difficult question for me because right now I'm still applying all the academic skills that I have, mostly because I'm still in R&D department. So I'm doing a lot of research, and so all that analytical skills, training, I still using that. And for me, I guess it's really easy to apply everything in that. The least useful scheme. I don't need to write the papers. Yay! I'm still involved in grants, so I do contribute in grant writing. So that was, and again, because I'm in R&D department, so that grant writing and understanding how industry university collaboration is happening, that's, I think, the most crucial thing for me, and that's what also brought me there. Because of my understanding, there is a gap. Industry doesn't really understand what's university doing, and university doesn't understand what is in industry happening. So I'm sort of in that space. I'm explaining to industry people exactly how it's done, while understanding from university side what needs to be done to bring industry on board. So that's works really well for me. That's what I brought from academia, and really happy about that. But I'm not sure. Well, at least Phil, have a go. What are you not using?
I think my answer to both, least and most, is grant writing. So it took me ages to learn, and I still wasn't great at it, how to write grants. And most of the bit to learn that I really was rubbish at was following the instructions, getting the font right, doing all that nitpicky stuff that you just don't want to get flagged. And the same with papers, right? Getting the format right, submitting it in the system right. All that stuff is just dripping with academia. Like, it is the only place it is useful. And I'm so glad to have that out of my life. And they are kind of useless skills in a lot of ways. Following instructions, great. Following instructions to that level, just crazy. But at the same time, the grant writing skills in terms of focusing on my audience when I write or when I talk, when I communicate in any way, and appreciating their diversity, their different backgrounds, their different trainings, which words am I going to use that mean something different to someone who's from engineering or from physics or from medical. Those kind of skills are so valuable in my day-to-day work, because any given day I'll speak to a fresh out of university data scientist, programmer, and then I'll go talk to an executive who's managing a portfolio of whatever, and then I'll go talk to a lawyer in the risk team. And those interactions are completely useless if you don't adjust your language between them, even though you're potentially talking about exactly the same thing in all three meetings. And that's a skill set that I think a lot of academics take for granted, that we hone it to such a level that we're competitive against some of the most intelligent and hardworking people in the country to get over that 10% threshold. And it's 10% of the top 1%. Like, don't forget that. Like, you're competing with the best of the best in academia to try and get that little edge over them. And you set that bar so high, and then you go into a completely forgiving environment like a Zoom call with a couple of colleagues. You are so overpowered. You are overskilled. You've leveled up to the absolute max, and now you're back to level 1 and just smashing all of the opponents easily. And I don't mean to suggest it's adversarial. I just mean to use the video game analogy. But you really realize how much work you've put into honing those skills when you come out of that environment and you're not competing with the top 1% to be the top 10% of them anymore.
Thanks, both. So we've got an audience question now, which taps into something that doesn't come up too much in the academia industry conversation, which is, tell us the downsides. What do you dislike? Anything you might be missing from academia as well. So in short, do you dislike anything, or what are the downsides of industry for you?
Phil, do you have any? I guess I'm still in the honeymoon period. I've been here only about 4 months, 3-4 months. So Phil, you've been longer. Do you have?
It's much more dynamic. So particularly an organization as big as NAB, they restructure. Like, at any one stage, a department somewhere is restructuring. because you've got like 35,000 staff. It's like a collection of universities on its own. And that can be really frustrating. And you miss the old rigid structure where you knew that person was professor of whatever because they were there for 20 years doing it. And there is a bit of a revolving door between your competitors as well. We joke in Melbourne that you go between the red team and the blue team, which is the red bank and the blue bank that have their headquarters here. But really, every couple of years, people move between the two. And when you're so big and the structure's so high, it's almost like shuffling a deck of cards every 12 months. So that's a bit of a downside. And you don't always know where your funding is going to come from because you don't have ARC and NHMRC as the permanent bodies that they are. You don't have 5-year funding or 3-year funding. And I know not everyone has that in academia either, but it's non-existent, not rare. It's non-existent in industry because funding is reviewed so regularly, priorities are reviewed so regularly. You're working in the world where things change constantly and they directly impact on you. So I think that fluid nature can be a challenge for a lot of people. And if you're in a less secure environment or you're in a team that, you know, is on the bad end of one of those changes, that can be really tough. And culture can move so quickly as well and go from a great positive place to a really difficult place to get stuff done because 3 key people change. And that's a change. That's a real challenge. But the flip side is chances are it's going to change again in 6 months. So, you know, you just got to keep your chin up. Whereas I think if you're in a department that goes south, it's a longer rebuild. And it's a longer downward trajectory as well, that you see things changing around you for much longer in academia.
Sorry, so just to do a B question, to do that, what is some of the things that you did in your academic roles that you're not doing now that you miss?
What I miss? Not sure. Again, I'm still in honeymoon.
I don't get to program as much. I miss getting my hands dirty with the data. I still get to do it occasionally, but my current role, I have sort of between 10 and 30 people working on different bits of the code every day. So more often I'm doing coordination and management stuff, but that's a function of the role, and I could move into a programming role if I wanted to, which is another good point. But that's something I definitely miss. And I miss the wins a little bit because you have the big papers, you have the big grants, you have the awards, you have the conferences. I think the wins are a bit more spaced out in industry and they're not as regular. You know, all the ARC grants are announced at a certain time and you know when they're coming. You don't really know when your next win will be. You know when your next deadline is, you know when your next like scary thing is, but you don't know when someone's going to turn around and say, oh, what you did had this big impact. Or, you know, the CEO called you out on a call yesterday because of this great project. Like that's a really unstructured positive feedback system. And, you know, it's good and bad in academia, but it certainly feels like you're addicted to the cocaine a little bit. That hit was always coming at the next announcement. And that was a hard transition. You got to kind of go. You got to go out and ask for the positives. I guess is the flip side of that. You got to ask for feedback because you don't have reviewers and panels constantly telling you if you're good or bad.
Well, on this side, I think here what I do is appreciated much more than in academia. In academia, you get the project done. Like, okay, yeah, good on you. Moving on, next grant writing, next thing. Here it's actually recognized. Oh, you've done that's wonderful. You've done it in a shorter time that you promised. It's even better. And so the recognition is much better in industry than you expected in any time in academia. So from this point of view, I find it's a really sort of fresh air.
Just to echo that, I agree entirely. And I think the positive feedback that I have had, the unstructured positive feedback, has felt more real because it's often centered on a real impactful outcome, a tangible thing. It's not another line on my CV. I'm not sure I've added many lines to my CV in the last 18 months in industry, but I do feel like I've had more impact and I've done more for the world in my time here.
Yes. So in academia, you're so overwhelmed with teaching, research, service. So it's more, it's really like when you're achieving something, you're actually forgetting that you're achieving something. No one will pat you on the back and say, good job, good done. So really in academia, you're overwhelmed with everything to see the impact that you're actually introducing. While here, you've done someone, it's recognized, you've done that. So yeah, it's much less noise in the system to see actually the impact you've done.
Yeah, I think, again, echoing that, the impacts of the outcomes are a little bit more real, a little bit more honest. And I'm not judged on the perceived prestige of the journal I published in or the grant I got that I haven't actually done anything. I just sold my project idea to a panel of people. They're not the most honest outcomes, if that makes sense. Whereas knowing exactly that this project failed for this many customers, that's a really real negative outcome. And knowing that the risk profile of a bunch of things has changed in the ethics and privacy space is a really real outcome that we can measure. It's immediate and it's brutally honest.
Fantastic, fantastic conversations. I am going to give you a final question. And I'd like you just for a few tips on how to leave well. So, reflecting on what you did and didn't do well when you left academia and went into industry, what would you recommend to others in terms of leaving well? And integrating a participant question, how did you leave well and leave others behind in academia feeling okay? So how did you leaving well impact others, still in the groups you're working in or the universities in terms of teaching and research? Phil, do you want to jump in first?
It's a really tough one. The news that I'd got a grant, a big fellowship, spread much, much, much quicker than the news that I'd left. So there were actually parties and champagne going on when I was the only one in the room who knew that I resigned yesterday. So that was not the best leaving process. And I hope no one who was in those felt bad about it once the news, or bad about me once the news came out that I'd actually resigned and I wasn't going to take that fellowship. That's a really minor thing though. On the bigger scale, I think making sure my students had another supervisor to pick up the slack was really critical. And I know Olga spoke about that earlier, just in case, because I didn't know what industry was going to be like. I said it was a non-negotiable, but who knows if they actually followed through on what they said and whether I'd have time for the students. That was really important. And in hindsight, I'm so glad I did it, because some of those students, that might have been a bad leaving environment if they didn't have all the support that they needed. I've been able to give everything they asked of me, which has been great. But I think that's partly a product of getting them more support to cover my butt and my absence. The other thing I'd say is just document everything, because it's one thing to not be in the building or feel like maybe a chief investigator feels betrayed because you co-wrote a grant with them and then left. Who knows? But the real stuff, the papers, the analysis, the revisions coming back on a paper and you help build a plot and you've lost the code because you left, or you can't remember how you did something because it was a year ago and you haven't picked it up. They're almost unforgivable things in a scientific collaboration. And all of the unwritten rules of being a good collaborator don't go away just because you're not employed by the university. I think they go a bit deeper than that. So, and they have societal impact, not university impact. So I'd say definitely make sure any of your students are well supported. Make sure you're honest with your CIs, but at the end of the day, just document everything and make sure that you can support people who might need you if things go wrong, or there's a really cool outcome and they want to chase it. You don't want to be the bottleneck or the blocker on that.
Yeah, I believe I left well, even though my resignation took a lot of people by surprise. I found that a lot of my colleagues thought I was kicked out of university, but it was my choice. I wasn't kicked out. I think I had a very successful career in academia, so it's my choice. In terms of the students, I think one of my students currently in audience and listening to that. So I believe I transferred those students quite well. So mostly because I really always on supervision, secondary supervision was always involved in a project, always followed the meetings and decisions were made together. So really knew what they're doing and how they're doing. So leaving students behind, it was sort of really sad not to see how their journey will continue without me. But in some of the cases, in other cases, it makes me really proud. I started something that they can go continue and do it on their own. And because I'm still staying in the space on Interface University, so I stay well with many of my colleagues, still talking and doing through the collaborations and just simply chatting to them about what's happening. So still involved a lot of at the university and know what's happening. So I'll keep updating what's happening at uni. My biggest advice, don't burn bridges. You never know when you'll need those. So that's my biggest advice.
Thank you. I would just like to thank Phil and Olga so much. I personally learned a lot, but I'm sure that all of this information will be being sucked up around Australia, because it really is such an important topic. And I think, we need to do more of these as the network. And Bernie will talk about the network. I'd just like to quickly, sum up some things that stuck out to me. I was surprised about, Phil's discussion of the diversity of cultures in industry. And I think it makes sense. And I think that would be an interesting environment to work in. I was struck by people on the outside pointing out just how many compromises we are making in science. And I think that's very true. I think that we all need to reflect on the purpose of our job and why we're doing what we're doing. I think it sounds like there's huge industry appreciation of the skills and capacity of people who have moved out of academia. And I'm really interested in sort of the outcomes being more real and honest, perhaps in industry than perhaps those outcomes we focus on in academia. And lastly, I do agree that science and academia has a useless fascination and adherence to formatting. The world would be a better place if we just loosened up about that. So I would just like to thank Phil and Olga so much for kicking off this series. And thank you so much. And I'll leave it to Bernie to tell you about the network and our next seminar in this series.
Thanks, Hannah. And thank you to Phil and Olga again. It was really interesting. I think it's so valuable that we all hear different people's stories, even if they don't align with our own, but just hearing about what processes people went through to identify what they really wanted. And I think so many people at the moment, we can be in this academic world and be working really hard because we love research, but it's for some people, maybe the environment that it currently is today is not the best, or maybe we're not being used the best in our skills that they could be. So it's really important we hear about the opportunities that exist outside of traditional academic paths and how you get there, because there isn't one pathway. And from everybody I've ever heard from, it's always about networks and personal stories. And so it's really important to hear the different personal stories that people have had, so we can start to think, okay, so if I wanted to do this, this is maybe where I would start.
Sorry, I wanted to add something else that I think wasn't much discussed, but it's in Debbie Marsh asked about, do you think it made others doubt that they should be keeping passion away in academia or just leave it? I just wanted to relate to that it's not there is no rule for everyone. If you think you build to work in academia, go and pursue your goals and do those things, because going into if everyone goes to industry, then there will be no science, there will be no innovation, there will be no other development. So people, that innovation does essentially comes into industry and then goes. So even with Phil's point that he would go to conferences to look what new innovations or new development been done, so he can bring back to the company. Same with me. I'm still following. And if you feel academia is your space, keep going and keep doing what you do. But if you feel that academia is not cut out for you, then just make a move. And a lot of people asking, how do you find how to make the move? Like, what you say to them, like why would they take us? There is a lot of skills that you can offer, and if you still like research, there are a lot of R&D in industry that people want to hire people with PhDs and the very skillful people into that. So you just go and find through networking, through just applying for the jobs, maybe not the first thing you go, but maybe first. But again, it's all individually and how you feel about that.
Absolutely, Olga. Thank you. And absolutely echo your point. This series is not to say everybody get out of academia. This series is to present what different worlds look like with all these amazing skills that we do acquire in our PhDs and our postdocs and the fellowships and everything else like that. There's no one point that you have to make a decision about academia versus industry. I've seen people go from professor into industry. It's something that we might all be constantly thinking about in our careers for, God, I don't even want to say how many decades we've got ahead of us. So to wrap up, what I want to let everybody know is we are continuing. This is a series where we've got people lined up, and we're going to continue to look for more stories of what people have done outside of academia, including really, really outside of academia. So even maybe the people that followed the pipe dreams that were not really even directly related. So our next one is most likely going to be on the 14th of September, but watch this space for exact details. And at the moment, we have someone who's in a government role, as well as somebody who's currently looking at analysing crime in real time with the Victorian Police Force. So we hope that you'll all come back. And in the meantime, think of questions that you might want to ask, even things that didn't get a chance to discuss today. And very briefly, I mentioned to you about the Brain Science Network at the beginning of this talk, and I just want to repeat that what we hope to be is a platform for brain scientists in the many different ways that brain scientists can be. It is not an academic group. We have people in academia and in industry and government and everything as part of that group, and we serve as a platform in many different ways, including this series. So reach out to us. We're currently revamping our website, which will make membership easier. But right now, Hannah, am I correct that they email you if they want to sign up?
I've provided the email in the chat. It is, you can go to the Australian Brain Alliance, and we have a sub-page there. We are about to launch our own webpage, but it's info@brainalliance.org.au.
Awesome. So
But you can email me if you'd like.
So to wrap up, Phil, Olga, thank you so much for giving us your time and your stories, the tips, the pros and the cons. I'm sure we'll all sit there and ruminate on these, as you know, half of us are in lockdown, so something to think about in the afternoon whilst working. So thank you all, thank you both, and we'll see you all hopefully in a couple of months. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.